Hi, my name is Eric, and today I'm going to be talking about chemical warfare in the First World War. World War I saw the advent of a lot of new innovations in warfare, like tanks, airplanes, and flamethrowers. One of the more horrifying of these was poison gas, due to the fact that it is really indiscriminate in who it killed, and it caused a lot of painful injuries. So let's get into it. First of all, it's important to remember that the idea of biological or chemical warfare wasn't necessarily novel to the First World War. Prior to this, armies had poisoned waterways or their own arrows and bullets in order to kill the enemy using science. At the Mongol siege of Kaffa, for example, the Mongols flung the bodies of their own dead who had perished due to the bubonic plague over the walls of the city in order to affect its inhabitants and force a surrender. And so then later in the 1800s, scientists began working with gases and chemical warfare as a means of killing the enemy. As you can see here, what would happen at first was they would put these gases in canisters and they would be released, and if there was a favorable wind, the gas would just blow over into the enemy. And so that was the idea at first. But then later on, they got more innovative and started putting the gases in hand grenades and even artillery shells. Prior to the war, the nations of Europe got together at the Hague Conventions and agreed not to use poison gases. They thought the idea of this was uncivilized, as they still kind of clung to the ideas of honor in warfare. They preferred out-rifling or out-maneuvering the enemy, which was in tactics from like the Napoleonic era. But they quickly found out, as soon as the war started, that with artillery and machine guns, it was really hard to preserve these tactics. And so, France was the first to use tear gas in the war, and while tear gas wasn't seen as a violation of the Hague Conventions, since it was non-lethal, the Germans certainly didn't take to it kindly, and so they started using tear gas against the Russians. Then at the First Battle of Ypres, at the urgings of Fritz Haber, who was a scientist who developed a lot of these chemical weapons, the Germans decided to use chlorine gas canisters and release them onto the French lines, and this resulted in some very heavy casualties on the French side. And so after this, the gloves were really off in the terms of chemical warfare, and each side began using poison gas against one another. The different gases that were used. So, as we already mentioned, tear gas was used by both sides early in the war, and then the Germans used chlorine, which this was the first lethal gas used. Chlorine gas is an asphyxiant, so it chokes out the affected soldier, but it's only really lethal in high doses. In small doses, it just causes kind of a discombobulation. And so, since it needs to be breathed in through the lungs, gas masks were a very effective way of combating it. And so once the Allies got these out, chlorine gas was kind of rendered irrelevant. The next gas developed was sulfur mustard, more commonly known today as mustard gas. And at the time it was known as Yellow Cross, since as you can see, this was a mustard gas shell and it was marked by the Yellow Cross at the tip of the shell. This is the most iconic gas of the war when we think of it today. It had a very yellow-green tint, and it tended to linger for weeks or even months. And so it was especially deadly since it rendered the use of gas masks still useful, but not as useful, since all it needed was exposure to the skin to cause a soldier to blister. Any exposure to the eyes led to temporary blindness. And so this was the most commonly used. However, it wasn't necessarily used by the Allies as much as the Germans, since in 1917 the Germans were very heavily on the defensive, so they would use this more commonly because they weren't going to be advancing anytime soon, whereas the Allies at least hoped that they would be, so they tended not to use this as much. And as you can see here, these are soldiers affected by mustard gas. A lot of them had bandages around their eyes, since exposure to the eyes would most commonly lead to temporary blindness. In fact, during his service in World War I, Adolf Hitler was affected by a gas attack and was temporarily blinded himself, and so in World War II he heavily advocated against the use of poison gas. The most deadly gas of the war, however, was phosgene gas. It was most deadly because it was colorless, and so it was very hard to detect. Supposedly it had a smell of musty hay, and so that was the most common way of detecting it. Like chlorine, is an asphyxiant. However, it's far more deadly than chlorine because the effects of it could sometimes take place days after the attack. So it's very hard for a soldier to know if he needed treatment because you wouldn't know if he had the symptoms until much after the attack happened. All told, poison gas led to about 1.3 million casualties in the war, 100,000 which were fatalities. Like I said, it just led to a lot of injuries and discomfort in the soldiers a lot, with blisters and stuff like that, but it was enough to take them out of combat and render them ineffective. And the Germans used the gas the most since they really incorporating it in their defense system and their efficient artillery barrages. The thing with poison gas was that it wasn't necessarily decisive in any major battle. A lot of offensive successes could be attributed to the effective use of artillery in clearing enemy defense posts, machine gun nests, and barbed wire. The British Battle of Cambrai can be attributed to the effective use of tanks on their part, and several battles can be linked with aerial superiority. However, no battle can really be traced back to the effective use of a poison gas attack. Poison gas was really just a major factor in the notion of wastage during the war, which was just trying to snipe, bombard, or gas as many enemy soldiers into either being wounded out of service or killed in order for them to not kill your soldiers. So it really just played into the war of attrition aspect of World War I. In the future, in the interwar period, the nations of Europe got together and agreed to the Geneva Protocol, which again banned poisonous weapons. And in World War II, the Axis and Allies tended to stockpile these kind of weapons, but they never used them in a significant way because they feared the retribution they would receive from the international community by doing so. Today, tear gas is still often used to prevent riots and crowd control. Nuclear radiation and nuclear warfare is a much bigger threat nowadays, since that affects a much larger area and is a lot more effective than just mustard gas canisters. However, the thought of chemical warfare is still very troubling to a lot of people, since the fact that it's indiscriminate in who it affects. At the time, the United Kingdom and France were both fearful that with the Germans bombarding or flying Zeppelins over their major cities, they thought that they might use chemical gas against their civilian populations, and so they would equip them with gas masks. And that's still a threat today. We're still afraid of a nuclear attack on our cities, and so this picture by Otto Dix really sums it up on how this kind of warfare really is dehumanizing. You no longer in warfare have to are concerned with being outmaneuvered or out-rifled by the enemy as much. It's more of modern warfare, as shown by World War I, is much more the enemy coming at you with any means necessary, whether it be artillery bombardments, poison gas attacks, flamethrowers, really just using any advantage, technological or scientific, they can over you to eliminate your soldiers and have theirs prevail. Well, that's all I have. These are the sources I use, and thank you for watching.